biology students? Your benevolent biology teacher here. In today's video, we're going to learn a bit about this guy Charles Darwin and how he wrote the book, literally, on what is now the single most important explanatory theory in biology. Our planet is an incredibly diverse place, biologically speaking. There are nearly 2 million named, classified species, and scientists estimate that there may be as many as 8 million more that we haven't even started to describe or classify yet. And that's not even counting the fact that out of all the species ever to inhabit planet Earth, from its humble beginnings 4.6 billion years ago until today, over 99% of all those species are now extinct, dinosaurs and woolly mammoths being only some of the most obvious examples of now extinct species. As for the organisms that are currently alive on planet Earth, the ones we've actually named and classified, there are approximately 60,000 species of vertebrates, 1.2 million species of invertebrates, 300,000 species of plants, about 40,000 species of fungi, lichen, brown algae, and bacteria. But where did they all come from? We know, based on the fossil record, that the species alive today have not always existed. So when did they begin to exist, and how did that happen? And what about those extinct species, the dinosaurs, woolly mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed tigers, and whatnot? Where did they come from, and why did they go extinct? That's why evolution is such an important explanatory theory. It explains where biodiversity comes from, and why it sometimes goes away, as was the case with the dinosaurs. Evolution explains how groups of living organisms change over time, and why they change in the way that they do. Evolution helps us to better understand our place in the universe, our origins, and our history, and helps us to appreciate how truly unique we are in relation to the rest of the animal kingdom. But evolution also helps us to understand how similar we are to the rest of the animals in terms of our basic structures, functions, and patterns of development. Evolution is a truly amazing process, and is sort of the underlying theory in biology. All biology makes more sense in an evolutionary context. Although Charles Darwin is frequently given sole credit for coming up with a theory of evolution by natural selection, in truth, it was not Darwin's idea alone. Darwin was a gifted scientist and a good writer, but he also based much of his theory upon the work of other scientists, which is really how all science works. No scientist makes discoveries in isolation, and every discovery builds upon what we already know and have previously discovered to be true. In today's video, we're going to learn about the history of evolutionary theory, focusing on the man at the center of this idea, this man right here, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was born to a wealthy family in England in the year 1809. Because his family was wealthy, he was able to spend his youth and young adult life devoted to his studies, going to school, attending college, and traveling. Although he considered going to school to become a priest, Darwin developed an interest in the natural world, living organisms and geology specifically, and these interests ended up becoming the focus of his life's work. After college, Darwin heard about an opportunity to put his love of naturalism to good use, on board an exploratory ship where he would be able to collect biological specimens from continents around the globe. In 1831, at the age of 22, Charles Darwin set sail aboard the HMS Beagle for a 5-year journey that would take him around the world. What he saw on this voyage would help him to formulate a theory that would rock the scientific community. It is important to note that Darwin wasn't simply a blank slate. He'd been learning about the natural world in one form or another for many years, and what he knew and learned prior to his journey helped to establish a meaningful context for what he saw aboard the Beagle. In fact, Darwin wasn't even the first Darwin to think about how life has changed over the history of its existence. Charles's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, published his own book on the subject, although history will indicate that he did not have many of the facts quite right. The book, which Charles had read, was called Zoonomia, and it spoke of animals descending from previous forms and passing beneficial traits from one generation to the next, which is really the crux of evolutionary theory. In his book, Erasmus pondered the following question. Would it be too bold to imagine that, in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, which the great first cause endued with animality, with the powers of acquiring new traits, attended with new propensities, directed by irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations, and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity, and of delivering down these improvements by generation to its posterity, world without end. Apparently it was not too bold an idea for Erasmus, or for his grandson Charles, to imagine. In fact, Erasmus liked the idea so much that he had the words e conscious omnia, which in Latin means all things from shells, emblazoned on his family crest. Charles Darwin was also versed on the work of one Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who had his own theory of evolution that turned out to be factually inaccurate in many ways. Lamarck said that organisms acquired or lost traits through use or disuse, and that these acquired traits not only helped an organism to thrive in its environment, but can also be passed on to the organism's offspring. The classic example of what is now called Lamarckian evolution is the neck of the giraffe. Lamarck said that the giraffe's neck got longer over time essentially by stretching. By using its neck to reach the leaves high in the tree, the giraffe compelled its neck to grow, and this new longer neck would be passed to its offspring. Likewise, a giraffe that did not use its neck for this purpose would continue to have a short neck. We know now that you can't develop a new trait simply by trying, and traits that we do acquire in our lives are not able to be passed on. We can't grow taller simply by stretching, and although we can build a huge amount of muscle mass through weightlifting, it is not as though we pass those huge muscles on to our children when they are born. It's like dyeing your hair pink, then expecting your baby to be born with pink hair. Not gonna happen. But we have the benefit of knowledge that Lamarck did not have in his day. And in his time, Lamarck was considered to be a pretty revolutionary thinker. Darwin thought so, although he also suspected that Lamarck's mechanism of use and disuse didn't fully make sense. Darwin had also read the works of James Hutton, a geologist, and one of the main proponents of an idea called deep time. At the time, it was generally assumed that the Earth was several thousand years old, but geologists who study this kind of thing were growing increasingly skeptical. By studying geology, and the rates at which geologic processes occur, processes like erosion, uplift, sedimentation, and so on, it was clear to Hutton that it would require huge amounts of time for these processes to create our modern landscape. Hutton said that it would have to take millions, if not billions of years for these processes to form our modern world. The big idea? That small changes accumulating over huge periods of time, millions to billions of years, could eventually produce sizable changes, from the Grand Canyon to the Himalayan mountain range. If small changes accumulated over millions of years could produce mountains like Mount Everest, think of the extent to which life itself could change over such a long period of time. Another geologist, working at about the same time, and who was also a supporter of the deep time idea, had his own theory that influenced Darwin's thinking. Charles Lyell's theory was called Uniformitarianism, and it really only makes sense if you accept that the Earth is billions and not thousands of years old. According to Uniformitarianism, the same processes that are currently working to shape our landscape today have been working to shape our landscape continuously for millions of years, and have been happening in the same way over that whole span of time. For example, we can watch water running over a rock and get a good idea for how quickly that rock will erode due to the movement of water. Because there is no reason to believe that erosion worked differently in the past than it does today, we must assume that erosion was an equally slow process at the time when the Grand Canyon was just beginning to form. But if you give that slow process millions of years to play out, then something as slow as erosion could explain how the Grand Canyon formed. Now, it's not just erosion that formed the Grand Canyon. Geologic uplift was simultaneously raising the ground while the Colorado was cutting downwards into the ground. But we also know that geologic uplift would work the same today as it did in the past. And since it happens pretty slowly today, that means that it must have also happened pretty slowly in the past. The end result? We would still need millions of years of geologic uplift and erosion in order to build the Grand Canyon. And we know that because the laws of nature today are the same as they were in the past. Uniformitarianism makes it clear that understanding the past helps us to understand what we see in the present. Knowing this no doubt helped Darwin to interpret the fossils he encountered on his journey around the world. Moreover, if uniformitarianism applies to geology, why not biology? Could our observations about biological processes playing out today help us to understand how they played out in the past, and how that affects the biodiversity we see around us today? So, With all these ideas swimming around in his brain, Darwin set sail aboard the HMS Beagle. Here we can see his path. Along the way, Darwin collected specimens, recorded observations, spoke and corresponded with a great many people, and eventually an idea began to take shape in his head. It would be years, however, before he would publish his findings. Along the way, Darwin made 3 observations that are key to understanding his theory. These observations have to do with patterns of variation in different groups of organisms around the planet. First, Darwin noticed that species vary globally. He noticed that similar organisms inhabit similar niches in similar environments, but many of these environments were isolated from one another, meaning that organisms couldn't simply be going back and forth between them. And even if they could, the organisms weren't exactly the same. They were just, similar. For example, consider the ostrich, the rhea, the emu, and the cassowary. These large flightless birds are strikingly similar in many ways, not the least of which is that they are all large and lack the ability to fly. But they live on very different parts of the planet. The ostrich lives in Africa, the rhea in South America, the emu in Australia, and the cassowary in New Guinea. Obviously, they didn't fly there in their present forms, and even if they had, they're different enough that we call them different species. But the striking similarities must mean something. Could these organisms be related to one another? And if so, what is the nature of this relationship? And how did they come to be different in some ways, while they maintain striking similarities in others? In addition to varying globally, Darwin also noticed that species vary locally. In the Galapagos Islands, for example, Darwin noticed many different species of finches. They were all clearly finches, according to our definition of what it means to be a finch, but there were so many different kinds of finches here, and they seemed to make their living in so many different ways as well. Some finches were well suited to eating the bigger, tougher seeds available on the drier islands, and they had large beaks perfectly suited to the task of cracking these large seeds. On nearby islands, there were finches who seemed very well suited to living on the wetter islands with smaller seeds, and these finches had smaller beaks, perfectly suited for picking up smaller, more delicate seeds. So many finches in so many different environments. They must be related to one another because they are all finches. But how did there come to be so many different varieties? How could they be so different in terms of beak size and in terms of the way that they live, but also have beaks that are so well suited for the seeds that happen to be available to them in their different environments? It was the same for the tortoises that Darwin observed in the Galapagos, clearly related to one another, but also clearly different, and each so well suited for the environment in which it lived. The tortoises living in environments where the available vegetation was growing up off the ground had shells that flared upwards to allow the tortoise to reach this vegetation, while tortoises living in environments where most of the vegetation was on the ground lacked this flared shell. Darwin was beginning to see a pattern. These organisms all seemed very well suited for their particular environments. Darwin also noticed that species varied in time. He wasn't just collecting live specimens, he was also collecting fossils when possible. Several fossils that Darwin found reminded him of animals living today, except that there were clear differences to indicate that they were not the same organism. He wondered if these extinct organisms could be related to, or could perhaps be the predecessors of modern organisms living today. Consider the glyptodont, a large extinct mammal that resembles a modern armadillo except for its enormous size. The armadillo is a pretty unique creature, one of a kind, really, except that this fossil creature is equally unique in its likeness to the armadillo. By the same token, fossils of extinct crocodiles are clearly very much like modern crocodiles except for the enormous size. It can't be coincidence, Darwin thought. These creatures must be related to one another, but once again, what is the nature of this relationship? And why does the smaller version of each form exist today, when clearly larger forms existed in the past? What could explain these changes? It occurred to Darwin that humans had been shaping the appearance of their animals for quite some time, in a way that causes shifts in the appearance and behavior of breeds while maintaining a likeness to the original form. Dogs, for example, are selectively bred for specific traits, among them obedience and personality. By controlling the breeding of dogs, and picking only dogs with the most desirable traits to mate and produce offspring, humans have produced many different lineages of domesticated dog. They were all still dogs, and in many ways maintained similarities to the original source material, wolves in this case, but each line has its own unique features that are produced by many generations of selective breeding. For example, if you want to breed a dog for hunting, one with a keen sense of smell, you would choose dogs who already demonstrated that they had a good sense of smell, breed those dogs, then assess the offspring. Sexual reproduction produces variety, and offspring are more than just clones of their parents. Just like humans have children who grow to be taller, shorter, or the same height as their parents, dogs also have offspring with varied traits. Some offspring would likely have a diminished sense of smell compared to their parents, while others would have a comparable sense of smell. You might also get a few pups who had a better sense of smell than their parents. These are the ones you want, and these are the ones who will breed in the next generation. The rest will be culled, a sad but true fact of the way dog breeding works. Once again, you would take the pups with the best sense of smell, raise them, breed them, then repeat the process. In each generation, the desired trait becomes stronger, until you've got a hunting dog with an amazing sense of smell. Darwin wondered, could nature possibly work the same way? Could a similar process to artificial selection cause the diversity of species that Darwin had noticed in the Galapagos? To Darwin, this was a reasonable idea, especially considering what he had learned from the economist Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus postulated that all populations have the capacity to grow in geometric ratios, which means that they have the capacity to grow exponentially. Malthus also postulated that most populations do not actually grow this way because they are kept in check by their environment, by shortages of resources, disease, drought, and competition with other species. This pressure keeps populations from growing larger than can be supported by their environment. Essentially, Malthus was describing the concept of a carrying capacity, a concept we learned about back in the fall when we were learning about population growth. This idea was meaningful to Darwin. Just like the dog breeder culls individual pups who lack the most desirable traits, so too might nature, and the organisms to fall victim to famine, disease, drought, and competition would no doubt be the individuals with the traits that were least suited to doing well in that environment. It was all coming into focus for Darwin, who spent years pondering and developing the idea that species would naturally change over time due to pressure exerted upon that species by the environment itself, and that species who were not well suited to their environment would eventually die out or go extinct. Two facts explained how this could be so: descent with modification and the struggle for existence. The latter of these refers to the fact that all organisms must struggle to survive in their environment. Nature is a brutal place. If you're not the hunter, you're the hunted, and all organisms must be well adapted in order to survive, lest they fall prey to another creature, or fail to catch prey of their own. Only the best would survive, and they would pass their gifts on to their offspring. But offspring are not exactly like their parents, and that's the descent with modification part. We are the descendants of our parents and grandparents, and we carry their genes in ourselves, but we are not clones. We are unique. We have modified the genetic blueprint that our parents had, and we possess certain traits that are purely our own. It works the same for all creatures. Mutations and genetic recombination during sexual reproduction result in new generations that are modified versions of the previous generation. The beneficial modifications will help offspring to survive, and the harmful modifications will hinder their ability to do so. Since more individuals with the beneficial modifications will live to reproduce, more individuals in the next generation will have this same modification, and some might even have a slightly better modification. Darwin puts it like this: as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as, consequently, there is a frequently reoccurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. This is what it means for a population to evolve, and it explains why organisms like the ostrich and emu and the finches in the Galapagos bear such striking resemblance to one another, despite being unique in their own ways. They all descended from a common ancestor. In modified form, based on which particular forms conferred the greatest survival advantage in a particular environment. Darwin was proud of his idea, for it is truly an elegant explanation for the diversity of life that we see around us. But he was also afraid to publish his theory for fear of what society would think. So Darwin waited, refining and writing his theory, but not publishing for fear of how people would react. Then one day, Darwin received a letter in the mail from a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. Like Darwin, Wallace was a naturalist, but while Darwin's journey took him to South America and the Galapagos, Wallace was busy making observations in Indonesia, this region right here in our map. This letter shocked Darwin because it sounded very much like Wallace, completely independent of Darwin, had come up with the same exact theory. Like Darwin, Wallace noticed the variations and similarities between species around the globe, and tried to explain how this diversity of form could have arisen due to the selective pressures exerted on species by their environments. The two men had never met, never spoken or communicated, and yet it seemed to Darwin as though Wallace could read his mind, and was about to steal credit for an idea that Darwin had been refining for decades now. This was not Wallace's intent, of course. He only wanted Darwin's opinion on his theory, for he had heard that Darwin was a gifted naturalist and thought that his theory might interest Darwin. But Wallace had no idea that Darwin was currently working on the exact same theory. In the end, a strange sort of arrangement was made to accommodate both men, because it isn't every day that two people independently come up with the same great idea at the same time. In August of 1858, Darwin and Wallace jointly published their work. The paper was titled, "On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties, and on the Perpetuation of Varieties in Species by Natural Means of Selection." The publication was accompanied by the following letter: "My dear Sir, the accompanying papers, which we have the honor of communicating to the Linnaean Society, and which all relate to the same subject, vis-a-vis the laws which affect the production of varieties, races, and species, contain the results of the investigation of two indefatigable naturalists, Mr. Charles Darwin and Mr. Alfred Wallace. These gentlemen, having independently, unknown to one another, conceived the very same ingenious theory to account for the appearance and perpetuation of varieties and specific forms on our planet, may both fairly claim the merit of being original thinkers in this important line of inquiry." So in the end, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace share credit for the theory of evolution by natural selection. And it is one of the most fundamental ideas at the heart of the study of biology. Biodiversity is the result of evolution, and evolution is driven by natural selection. Call it survival of the fittest. So when we ask ourselves where all those 2 million named and 8 million unnamed species came from, the answer is evolution, the process by which groups of organisms change and adapt to their environments over time, and which causes them to disappear into extinction if they can no longer keep up with changes in the environment. And the book that Darwin kept referring to, the one that he hoped would earn him back his distinction as the foremost authority on evolutionary biology, is also one of the most famous scientific publications of all time, and it is still in print and readily available in bookstores and libraries today. It is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and the first edition was published in 1959. Darwin updated his book at least 10 times, adding a little bit more with each new edition. By the time he reached the 10th edition, he even added a line, just one line at the very end of the book, about humans, cautiously postulating that perhaps this same idea could explain our origins as well as the origins of other species. It is largely because of this book that we remember the theory of evolution by natural selection as Darwin's theory and not as Darwin and Wallace's theory, but that would actually be the more accurate way to remember it. Despite the elegance of his theory, Darwin was indeed ridiculed for his ideas, just as he feared he would be. He was frequently the subject of satire and caricatures, many of which accused Darwin of suggesting that we have evolved directly from apes, and happily turning Darwin himself into an ape as a sign of incredulity at the prospect. This comic, for example, reads as follows: "The defrauded gorilla. That man wants to claim my pedigree. He says he is one of my descendants. Mr. Berg. Now, Mr. Darwin, how could you insult him so?" So perhaps society wasn't quite ready for the idea in 1859, but we are coming around slowly. Suffice it to say that Darwin's legacy is safe. His theory, the theory of evolution by natural selection, is one of the most revolutionary ideas science has ever produced. Everything about biology makes more sense in light of this theory, and for people like me, it makes biology all the more wondrous and amazing. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thanks for watching, and remember, you can go back and watch this video as many times as you would like until you feel like you understand this guy called Charles Darwin and how he came up with one of the most important theories of all time.